The phone rang at 6:12 a.m. on a cold, gray morning, pulling Elise Gardner from a restless sleep. The call was brief, a neighbor reporting that her father, Robert Gardner, had been found unresponsive in his study. Less than an hour later, paramedics confirmed his death. It was January 15, 2024, a date Elise would later recall with a sense of dread. The cause of death was initially attributed to a sudden heart attack. Robert was 72 and had been showing signs of stress in the weeks leading up to his death. His passing, though tragic, seemed to align with his age and the burdens he carried. However, as the days passed, the circumstances around Robert's death would begin to unravel, revealing far more than Elise could have ever imagined. Robert Gardner had been a well-respected man in the quiet town of Riverside, Connecticut. A retired engineer, he was known for his methodical nature and a deep sense of responsibility towards his family. After Elise's mother passed away in 2018, Robert remarried a year later. His new wife, Karen, brought with her a son from a previous marriage, Matthew. The blended family was never particularly close, but they maintained a facade of normalcy for the sake of the town and Robert's reputation. Elise, now in her early 30s and recently divorced, had returned to the family home to assist with the arrangements following her father's death. The family home, a stately colonial mansion on the outskirts of town, was imposing yet familiar. It had been in the Gardner family for generations, a symbol of their status and history. Elise had grown up in this house, every creaking floorboard and drafty window embedded in her memory. Now the house felt different, cold, unwelcoming, as if it too sensed the unsettling undercurrents that would soon surface. On January 17th, 2 days after Robert's death, Elise and Matthew sat together in the study, sorting through their father's papers. The study had always been Robert's sanctuary, a place where he could escape from the pressures of life. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with old engineering manuals and historical texts. A heavy oak desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers and photographs. As they sifted through the documents, Elise came across a sealed envelope tucked inside a worn, leather-bound journal. The envelope was addressed to her, written in her father's neat, precise handwriting. Curiosity piqued, Elise carefully opened the envelope. Inside, she found a letter that her father had written on December 28, 2023, just weeks before his death. In the letter, Robert expressed concerns about his health, but what caught Elise's attention was the mention of a mistake he had made many years ago. The letter was vague, but Robert hinted at something that had been weighing heavily on his mind. He urged Elise to look after the family and to ensure that the truth, whatever that might be, would be protected. Elise's mind raced as she read the letter. What mistake could her father have been referring to, and why had he been so cryptic? She glanced over at Matthew, who was absorbed in a stack of legal documents, seemingly oblivious to her discovery. Matthew had always been a quiet and reserved person, his relationship with Robert polite but distant. Unlike Elise, who had always been close to her father, Matthew had kept a certain emotional distance from the family. Elise had never thought much of it until now. As the days passed, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more she thought about her father's letter, the more certain she became that his death was not as straightforward as it seemed. On January 20th, Elise decided to dig deeper. She began by reviewing her father's medical records, which were meticulously kept in a file cabinet in his study. What she found raised even more questions. Robert had undergone a series of tests in late December, and the results were inconclusive. There was no indication of a heart condition severe enough to cause sudden death. This discovery led Elise to a chilling realization. What if her father hadn't died of natural causes? What if his death had been orchestrated? The thought was terrifying, but the more she considered it, the more it made sense. The mistake Robert had mentioned in his letter now seemed like a clue, a breadcrumb left for Elise to follow. By January 23rd, Elise had become consumed by her quest for the truth. She began to scrutinize everything: her father's correspondence, his financial records, even his relationship with Karen and Matthew. She noticed small inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. Her once unshakable trust in her family began to erode, replaced by suspicion and fear. As Elise delved deeper, a new, more disturbing possibility emerged. What if someone in the family had a motive to harm Robert? The idea was unthinkable, but the evidence, or lack thereof, pointed in that direction. Elise knew she had to be careful, but the more she uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. By the end of January, Elise was certain of one thing. Her father's death was no accident, and if she didn't find out the truth soon, she feared she might be next. On the evening of January 25th, 2024, Elise found herself standing in the dimly lit hallway outside her father's study. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every creak of the floorboards sound like a whisper of something unseen. She had been unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the letter, the inconsistencies in the medical records, and the growing sense of dread that had settled over her like a heavy fog. It had been 10 days since Robert Gardner's death, and the initial shock had given way to a gnawing suspicion that refused to leave Elise alone. She had spent the last few days combing through every piece of paper, every note, and every document her father had left behind. Each discovery only deepened her unease. Elise's investigation began to take on a life of its own, driven by a need for answers she wasn't even sure she wanted to find. On January 22nd, she had come across a peculiar entry in her father's financial records. A large withdrawal had been made from one of Robert's accounts on December 30th, 2023, just days before his death. The amount, $50,000, was significant, but what stood out most to Elise was the fact that there was no corresponding purchase or investment to explain it. The money had simply vanished, with no indication of where it had gone. This discovery haunted her. What could her father have needed such a large sum of money for, so close to his death? And why had he been so secretive about it? Elise couldn't shake the feeling that this unexplained transaction was tied to the mistake her father had mentioned in his letter. But without more information, it was just another piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. As January drew to a close, Elise's focus shifted to Karen, her stepmother. Karen had always been a quiet presence in the house, unassuming, reserved, almost too perfect. In the days following Robert's death, she had been composed, her grief seemingly muted. Elise couldn't help but wonder if Karen knew more than she was letting on. The thought was unsettling, but it was one Elise couldn't ignore. On the morning of January 26th, Elise decided to look into Karen's background. What she found surprised her. Before marrying Robert, Karen had been married twice before, both marriages ending in what were described as tragic circumstances. In 2005, Karen's first husband had died in a car accident, and in 2013, her second husband had succumbed to a sudden illness. Both cases had been ruled as accidents, but the timing struck Elise as odd. 2 husbands dead, both under unusual circumstances, and now her father had died unexpectedly as well. The pattern was impossible to dismiss. Elise's unease grew into something darker as she considered the possibility that Karen could be involved in her father's death. She remembered the times Karen had insisted on handling Robert's medications, the way she had always been so attentive, almost overly so. Had Karen been slowly poisoning Robert? The thought sent a chill down Elise's spine, but it also sparked a determination in her that she hadn't felt before. The following day, January 27th, Elise searched the house for anything that might confirm her suspicions. In the back of a drawer in the kitchen, she found an empty vial of prescription medication, one that her father had never taken, as far as she knew. The label was faded, but Elise could still make out the name of the drug, digoxin, a heart medication that, if misused, could be lethal. Her heart pounded as she realized the implications. If Karen had been giving this to her father without his knowledge, it could explain his sudden death. With this discovery, the pieces began to fall into place. The large withdrawal, the suspicious deaths of Karen's previous husbands, the hidden vial of digoxin, everything pointed to the possibility that Karen had orchestrated Robert's death. But Elise knew she needed more than just circumstantial evidence. She needed proof, and she needed to act quickly before Karen realized what she was up to. By the evening of January 28th, Elise's fear had turned into resolve. She knew she was getting close to the truth, but she also knew that the closer she got, the more dangerous her situation became. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that every move she made was being tracked. But she couldn't stop now. She was too close, and the truth was too important. As Elise prepared to confront Karen, she couldn't help but wonder if she had already waited too long. What if Karen was already one step ahead? The thought lingered in her mind as she steeled herself for what was to come, knowing that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. By the morning of January 29th, 2024, Elise Gardner could no longer ignore the growing dread that had taken hold of her. She stood in her father's study, the same room where she had discovered his cryptic letter just weeks before. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The discovery of the empty vial of digoxin had cemented her suspicions, but it also left her with more questions than answers. She knew she needed proof, something undeniable that would expose Karen's true nature. Elise's search had uncovered more than just the vial. Among her father's papers, she had found references to a private investigator, someone Robert had hired in December 2023, to look into what he described in his notes as personal matters. Elise couldn't help but wonder if this was connected to the mistake her father had alluded to in his letter. What had he discovered that made him feel the need to involve an investigator, and how did it tie into his sudden death? Determined to find out, Elise contacted the investigator, a man named Frank Collins. She reached him on the afternoon of January 29th, explaining that she was Robert Gardner's daughter and needed to know what her father had been investigating. Collins hesitated at first, bound by client confidentiality, but the mention of Robert's death seemed to change his mind. He agreed to meet Elise later that evening at 7 p.m. at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The hours leading up to the meeting dragged on painfully. Elise's anxiety grew with each passing minute, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and every creak of the old house seemed to amplify her paranoia. The tension was nearly unbearable by the time she left the house, driving through the dark, rain-soaked streets to meet Collins. When Elise arrived at the cafe, the place was nearly empty, with only a few patrons scattered across the dimly lit space. Collins, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, sat in a corner booth, his back to the wall. Elise joined him, and after a brief, tense exchange, he slid a manila envelope across the table toward her. Inside, Elise found a series of photographs, documents, and handwritten notes, all meticulously compiled by her father. As she flipped through the contents, a horrifying realization began to take shape. The documents revealed that Robert had discovered Karen's real identity. She wasn't who she claimed to be. Karen's real name was Catherine Shaw, and she had been involved in several fraudulent schemes across the country, changing identities and marrying wealthy men who later died under suspicious circumstances. Robert had learned that Karen's previous marriages had ended in tragedy. Both husbands dead, their estates left in disarray, with Karen disappearing shortly afterward. The photographs showed Catherine, meeting with a man in the weeks leading up to Robert's death. The man, identified as Daniel Harper, had a criminal record involving fraud and conspiracy. Elise's stomach turned as she realized that this was the man who had likely helped Karen in her schemes, and that they had been planning something similar with Robert. But Robert had uncovered the truth too late, and it had cost him his life. Elise's hands trembled as she read the notes, each revelation more damning than the last. Robert had intended to confront Karen on December 30th, 2023, the same day as the large withdrawal from his account. The money, Elise now understood, had likely been a payoff or a desperate attempt to buy time. But whatever had transpired between Robert and Karen on that day, it had led to his death just 2 weeks later. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, but with it came a cold, hard clarity. Elise knew what she had to do. She had to take this information to the police to expose Karen for who she truly was. But as she prepared to leave the cafe, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Karen had always been one step ahead. She had orchestrated Robert's death with meticulous precision, and she would undoubtedly be prepared for any threat to her plans. Elise's fear was confirmed when she returned to the family home at 9:15 p.m. that night. The house was dark, but as she entered, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. She noticed a light coming from under the door of the study, the only room in the house still illuminated. Heart pounding, she approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but the need for answers pushed her forward. As she reached for the doorknob, she hesitated, her mind racing with the possibilities. What if Karen was waiting for her? What if this was a trap? The rehook tightened its grip on Elise, pulling her into the room where the final horrifying truth awaited. Whatever was behind that door, she knew it would change everything, and there was no going back. Elise Gardner stood frozen in the doorway of her father's study, the clock on the wall showing 9:20 p.m. on January 29th, 2024. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows across the floor. Her heart raced as she took in the scene before her. A neat stack of documents on the desk, a half-empty glass of wine, and Karen seated in the chair that had once been Robert's. Karen's eyes met Elise's, and for a brief moment, the two women stared at each other in silence. Elise's mind raced, replaying the events of the past few weeks. The discovery of her father's letter, the unexplained withdrawal, the damning evidence linking Karen to her father's death. It all led to this moment, a final confrontation she hadn't fully prepared for. She could see it in Karen's eyes, the awareness that Elise knew everything, that the careful web of lies was unraveling. But Elise also knew she was in danger. Karen's calm demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to the panic Elise felt inside. The empty vial of digoxin flashed in her mind, a reminder of just how far Karen was willing to go to protect her secrets. Elise took a step back, her hand tightening around the envelope she had brought with her, containing all the evidence she had gathered. Karen's voice broke the silence, cold and calculated. She had been expecting this, but what she hadn't expected was Elise's resolve. With one last look at the room where her father had spent his final days, Elise turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. She knew where she had to go next, straight to the police. The events that followed moved quickly. By January 30th, 2024, Elise had handed over the evidence to the authorities. An investigation was launched and Karen was arrested. The media descended on Riverside, Connecticut, as the story of Robert Gardner's death and the twisted truth behind it came to light. In the end, justice was served, but the cost was high. As Elise stood outside the courthouse on February 2nd, 2024, watching Karen being led away in handcuffs, she felt a deep sense of loss. The truth had been uncovered, but it had shattered her family beyond repair. All that remained were the echoes of what once was, and the shadows of secrets that had finally come to light.